It was a hot morning, the kind where the sun burns into your skin before you even realize it's up. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I adjusted the welding torch in my hands, sparks dancing like a wildfire in the dry air. The ranch had been in my family for generations, long before this little neighborhood popped up and tried to tell me how to live. Grandpa's land, passed down from father to son, had never been much to anyone but us. And to me, it was everything. The clang of metal against metal mixed with the scent of burning steel, the familiar rhythm of a day spent fixing fences, maintaining the land, and keeping the cattle from wandering onto Metobrook Drive. I had learned to love that rhythm, the feeling of hard work under the vast, open sky, the wind tangling in my hair, the satisfaction of making something right that had once been broken. I had no interest in joining the rest of the world, no need to follow the cookie-cutter standards of the suburbs that had sprung up across the street. This land was more than a piece of property. It was my family's legacy, my future, my past. But that morning, as I stood by the front gate, adjusting the metal fencing that had kept my cattle from wandering for decades, a sound interrupted the steady pulse of my work. The sharp click of heels, steady and deliberate, like the woman wearing them had an agenda. I didn't have to look up to know it wasn't anyone I knew. I'd lived here long enough to recognize the sound of a stranger's approach. And when I did finally look up, I saw her, the woman who would change everything. She was stepping out of a BMW sedan, a car that had once been white but now looked like a faded ghost of its former self. She carried herself with the kind of cold arrogance that only someone who believed they were in control could. She was in heels, the kind that clicked too loudly on concrete, and her outfit was all wrong. A purple dress, which had long seen its better days, paired with a blazer that looked like it had tried to be fashionable but failed miserably. Fake fur lined the collar, half flattened from neglect, the other half standing up in rebellious tufts. But what really caught my attention wasn't the mismatched outfit or the faded car. It was the way she acted. She didn't look at me when she approached, didn't even offer a greeting. She marched right up to my workbench and slammed a piece of paper down, hard enough to rattle the coffee mug I had sitting there. No hello, no introduction. Just that cold, hard stare that screamed authority. "You have 10 days to wipe this ranch clean off the map," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. That was how it started. Her name, as she introduced herself without waiting for me to speak, was Lynette Carrian. "Chairwoman of the Metobrook Heights Homeowners Association," she said, as if the title alone would make me bow to her will. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. She launched straight into it. My property, my ranch, was bringing down the property values of the surrounding homes. Those cookie-cutter houses that had sprouted up 5 years ago like mushrooms after a storm. She pointed toward them with pride, as if she were showing off some kind of masterpiece. To me, they looked more like a sad collection of identical homes, each with perfectly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes, all lined up in neat rows. If that was her idea of beauty, I wanted no part in it. I could feel the heat rising in my chest as she spoke, but I kept my voice steady. I knew better than to let her see the anger bubbling inside me. "What exactly is the problem, Miss Carrian?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. I had learned long ago that remaining calm, no matter how furious I was the best way to handle situations like this. People like her, people who thought they could bulldoze through anyone who didn't fit their mold, they thrived on getting a rise out of you. And I was done being that guy. She didn't seem to care that I was trying to keep the conversation civil. In fact, she seemed more annoyed that I was even asking for clarification. She pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers, and started flipping through it like she was looking for some kind of evidence that would destroy me. "The problem, Mr. Holt," she said, as if she were explaining something to a child, "is that your ranch is an eyesore. It's lowering the value of every property in this neighborhood." I took a slow breath, trying to hold my ground. I had been here long before these people and their cookie-cutter houses, long before their HOA rules and regulations. My family's ranch had been here through it all, standing proudly despite everything around it changing. And they thought a few lines on a piece of paper could just push me out? She continued, oblivious to the tension in the air, pointing at the houses as if they were the pinnacle of perfection. Those homes were expensive, she said, her voice dripping with self-importance. The families living in them paid good money to be part of a well-maintained, upscale community. And your property is ruining their investment. I looked at the houses. They were nice enough, I suppose, if you liked the idea of every lawn being the same height, every mailbox the same distance from the curb. But to me, they were just lifeless boxes. Empty shells that looked like they had been manufactured on an assembly line. I've been living here since before those houses existed, I told her, my voice firm now. In fact, I was here before this road even had a name. My family has owned this land for 3 generations. Her hand waved dismissively, as if my family's history meant nothing. That's irrelevant now, Mr. Holt. Times change. The area is developing, and your ranch doesn't fit with the vision we have for our community. She was talking about a vision, but all I could hear was power. Power that she thought she could wield simply because she was in charge of some neighborhood association. And she was using that power to bully me, to try and force me off land that had been in my family's care for decades. But the thing is, I wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. From that moment on, I knew I would take action. And she was going to regret underestimating me. And then she dropped the bombshell. You have 10 days, she said, slapping a piece of paper down onto my workbench with a force that rattled the mugs and made me see red. Remove all livestock, tear down those unsightly outbuildings, and bring your property into compliance with neighborhood standards. After that, we will be forced to take legal action. I picked up the paper, quickly scanning through the ridiculous complaints. Excessive noise from livestock. Unpleasant odors. Heavy vehicles creating road damage. Structures not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics. Every single complaint was either a complete fabrication or simply a part of life on a working ranch. What if I refuse? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her smile turned colder, more calculated. Then we will make sure you understand there are consequences for people who don't cooperate with community improvement efforts. And just like that, the gloves were off. I knew right then that I wasn't just dealing with some HOA chairwoman who liked to throw her weight around. I was up against something much bigger, a system designed to bulldoze people like me. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not without a fight. That was the first day I realized just how far I was willing to go to keep my land, my family's legacy, safe. And I wasn't about to let her, or anyone else, push me off it. The next few days felt like a blur. There was so much to process, so many emotions bubbling up beneath the surface. Anger, frustration, but mostly disbelief. I had never imagined that something like this could happen, not to me, not to my ranch. I had always considered the land to be a sanctuary, a place where everything had its place, where generations of hard work had cultivated not just the soil, but a life built on perseverance and respect. And here she was, Lynette Carrian, trying to tear it all down in one swift, calculated move. I spent the rest of that day out in the field, fixing the water lines and tending to the cattle, trying to calm my mind. The physical labor always helped, grounding me when my thoughts got too loud. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many fences I mended or posts I set, Lynette's words echoed in the back of my mind. 10 days. 10 days to tear it all down. I knew I had to fight back, but I wasn't sure how. The legal threats, the supposed violations, the power of the HOA, it all seemed like too much. Who was I to stand up to that kind of authority? I was just one guy, a rancher with a piece of land, trying to make an honest living. But one thing I knew for certain was this: I wasn't going to let them push me out without a fight. That night, after I fed the cattle and made sure everything was in order, I sat on the porch, looking out over the land. The sun had set, and the sky was streaked with pink and orange, the last vestiges of daylight fading into the cool evening air. The sound of crickets filled the silence, a constant reminder of how peaceful it was here, how quiet this life could be. And yet, I could feel the storm brewing just over the horizon. The next morning, I went to the post office and picked up my mail, not expecting much other than the usual bills and junk. But tucked in between the envelopes was another letter from Lynette and the HOA. This one wasn't a violation notice, though. It was something worse, a demand for me to attend a meeting at the Metobrook Heights Community Center. They had called it a community discussion, but I knew better. This was their way of tightening the noose, of making me face their wrath in front of everyone. I didn't want to go. I knew it was going to be a waste of time, just another attempt to make me feel small, to make me doubt myself. But I also knew that if I didn't show up, they would just find another way to come at me. So, I marked the date on the calendar and tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. The morning of the meeting, I felt the familiar knot in my stomach. I had been through my fair share of tough situations, but this felt different. This was personal. It wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about something bigger, the way people like Lynette, people who hid behind rules and regulations, used their power to destroy the lives of those who couldn't fight back. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I drove to the community center, the same one that Lynette had used as a backdrop for her power trip, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry bees. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel the eyes on me. The whole room was filled with folding chairs, the kind that made you feel like you were at some kind of formal hearing. The smell of stale coffee and the faint hum of the lights only added to the sterile, uncomfortable atmosphere. Lynette was at the front of the room, standing behind a podium like she was ready to lecture a room full of misbehaving children. Her laptop was open, and a projector sat beside her, waiting to illuminate the screen with whatever fabricated evidence she had put together. I didn't need to look at her to know what was coming. This was going to be her show, and I was just the unfortunate soul she had decided to target. As I took my seat, I noticed the man from the meeting at my ranch was sitting at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd with a look of quiet satisfaction. He wasn't participating in the meeting, but I could feel his presence. His body language screamed power. He was the kind of guy who didn't need to speak to make people fall in line. And that's exactly what he was doing. He was here to make sure I understood that I wasn't going to win this fight. Lynette started her presentation by dimming the lights, and I could feel the shift in the room. Everyone was suddenly focused on the screen as the first slide appeared. In bold, red letters, it read, "Community Standards Enforcement, Protecting Our Investment." The irony of it hit me immediately. Here I was, fighting to protect my land, my legacy, and they were sitting there, pretending that they were doing the same. The next slide was a series of photos, my ranch, taken from every angle, each one blown up to a size that made every detail look as dramatic and threatening as possible. There was my barn, which had always stood proud on this land, now labeled as a deteriorating structure affecting neighborhood aesthetics. There were my cattle, peacefully grazing in the pasture, their presence twisted into a violation of livestock creating noise and odor. And the best part? A picture of my old pickup truck, which Lynette had the nerve to call a heavy commercial vehicle damaging public roads. The photos had been carefully edited. She'd taken pictures during the morning feeding time when everything was a little more chaotic, when the animals were active, kicking up dust in the dry air. She'd zoomed in on a water trough that needed cleaning, making it look like some kind of environmental hazard. And when she'd taken pictures of the manure pile, she had found the perfect angle to make it look like it was about to collapse into some kind of toxic waste disaster. It was all lies. But that was the point, wasn't it? The point wasn't to show the truth. The point was to scare people into believing that my ranch was a danger, that it was a threat to the community. She wanted people to look at my property and see something that needed to be eradicated, something that didn't belong. As the slides continued, I watched the people in the room. Most of them were nodding along, their faces grim as they looked at the images. But a few were skeptical, their brows furrowed in confusion. They didn't know me, but they knew something wasn't right. When Lynette finished her presentation, she opened the floor for comments, and that's when things started to get interesting. A woman stood up, someone I had never seen before. She was holding a manila envelope, the same kind of envelope that Lynette had brought to my ranch. "Before we discuss Mr. Holt's property," she said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, "I think we need to discuss some other community standards issues." The room went silent. She walked to the front, dropped the contents of the envelope onto the table, and began reading. These weren't violation notices for my property. These were emails Lynette had sent to other families in the neighborhood. "Mrs. Patterson, your rose bushes are extending 6 inches beyond the approved setback line. You have 48 hours to trim them or face fines of $50 per day," she read aloud, her voice unwavering. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Colleen continued, reading more emails that contained absurd demands. Mailboxes that needed to be replaced because they showed signs of weathering, children's bicycles in driveways for longer than allowed, lawns that didn't meet the perfect height. It was petty. It was all petty. And it was a pattern of harassment. As Colleen spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The murmurs grew louder, the tension palpable. People were starting to realize the truth, that Lynette wasn't here to protect the community, she was here to control it. Lynette tried to regain control, but her usual arrogance had vanished. She was now defensive, her voice shaking with frustration. "These enforcement actions were all within HOA guidelines," she said, but it didn't have the same weight it had earlier. The crowd wasn't buying it. Then, Colleen dropped the final bombshell. "This isn't about community standards," she said. "This is about one person using the HOA to intimidate and control their neighbors." And just like that, the room changed. Lynette had lost her grip on the situation. She was no longer the confident chairwoman, now she was just a woman desperate to maintain control. The tables were turning, and I was starting to see how deep the corruption went. Lynette's empire was crumbling, and I had a front row seat to watch it happen. The next week felt like a slow-motion train wreck, each day bringing more pressure, more tension, and yet somehow, more clarity. I kept thinking about what had happened in that meeting at the community center. Colleen had done something unexpected, something brilliant. She had exposed Lynette for what she really was, a bully hiding behind a mask of authority, using the power of the HOA to manipulate and intimidate her neighbors. And the best part? It worked. The atmosphere in the room had changed the moment Colleen started reading Lynette's emails. I could see it in the faces of the people who had been quietly nodding along to Lynette's presentation. They weren't just hearing about the violations anymore. They were hearing about the real issue, Lynette's abuse of power. But that didn't mean the fight was over. In fact, it had only just begun. After the meeting, I was approached by a few residents who had seemed to question Lynette's authority. They were wary, unsure if they were ready to take on the HOA themselves, but they were relieved to see someone standing up against it. They offered their support, and I could tell they were looking for someone to lead them. Colleen had shown that there was power in numbers, but I knew I couldn't take this on alone. I needed more allies, more people who were fed up with the HOA's iron grip on the community. But as much as I wanted to feel victorious, I knew better than to think this was a simple win. Lynette and her crew were powerful, too powerful to be taken down by a few disgruntled homeowners and one rancher. I could feel their eyes on me. Even after the public exposure, they weren't going to just walk away. I wasn't naive enough to think they would. The day after the meeting, I decided to pay a visit to my lawyer, Graham Wexler. I had known Graham for years, ever since I had to deal with a property dispute a while back. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who got flashy commercials or big-name clients, but he was smart, and he understood the rural way of life. He had been instrumental in helping me with various legal matters in the past, and I needed him now more than ever. When I walked into his office, the cool air and the smell of paper seemed to settle my nerves. I sat across from him, and he looked up from his desk, his face unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. He knew when something was up. "I'm in a fight, Graham. And it's not just about my property anymore. It's about everything that Lynette and her HOA stand for. I've got a lot of anger, but I also need to be smart about this. I need to know what my options are." He didn't hesitate. "Well, the first thing you need to do is stay calm. This could get messy, but you've got the truth on your side. Now, let's look at what they've got. If they're threatening legal action, we need to be prepared." We spent hours going over the violation notices, Lynette's emails, and the footage I had from my security cameras. Graham was thorough, methodical. He knew that the only way to win this was to play their game and do it better. And as we went through the details, I could see the fire in his eyes. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. We weren't just going to sit back and let Lynette and Victor steamroll us. We were going to fight. But fighting meant more than just showing up at meetings or posting videos. I had to get under their skin. I had to hit them where it hurt. That was when I made the decision. I wasn't going to sell my land. I wasn't going to give up. But I also wasn't going to sit back and take their abuse anymore. I had something they didn't have, the truth. And I was going to use it. I had already started collecting evidence. The water contamination incident was the perfect example. I knew it wasn't just a random act of mischief. Someone had intentionally sabotaged my water supply, hoping that it would give them the leverage they needed to force me out. I knew it was one of Lynette's people, probably that man who had been lurking in the background of the HOA meeting. I had the footage, and I wasn't going to let it go to waste. The next step was making sure that everything I had was locked down. Graham was helping me file a formal complaint with the county, and he was making sure that all my evidence was airtight. I had no idea how far they would go to get what they wanted, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them win without a fight. It wasn't long before I got the call. The county environmental office had received a complaint about possible water contamination on my property. I had expected this, of course. The sabotage was too blatant for them to ignore. What I hadn't expected was how quickly it would escalate. They sent out an inspector, a woman named Janet Morrison, who was sharp and no-nonsense. When she arrived, I could see the skepticism in her eyes, the way she scrutinized everything. I showed her the contaminated water line, the hole that had been drilled in the pipe, and the evidence of chemicals that had been poured into it. "This doesn't look like an accident," she said, her voice measured. "Whoever did this wanted it to be found." I nodded. "I know. I think it was done on purpose. I've got cameras set up around the property. I'll show you the footage." The look in her eyes shifted as she watched the footage from my cameras. The three men, their faces hidden under hoods, sneaking around the property in the middle of the night, pouring chemicals into the water line, it was all there. And the man I recognized from the HOA meeting was clearly one of them. "This is definitely sabotage," Janet said after watching the footage. "Whoever did this was sloppy, and they're going to pay for it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The county was going to press charges, and the people responsible for contaminating my water were going to be held accountable. This wasn't just about fighting the HOA anymore, it was about exposing them for the criminals they were. But that wasn't enough. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I needed to dig deeper. I couldn't just let Lynette and her cronies get away with their actions. I had to expose the entire operation, the corruption, the manipulation, the deceit. If I wanted to protect my land, I had to go after them where it would hurt the most. That's when I hired Rebecca Torres. She wasn't just any private investigator. She specialized in financial investigations, and that's exactly what I needed. I didn't care about tracking down Lynette's every move, I needed to find out who was behind this, who was pulling the strings, and why they were targeting me. What Rebecca uncovered blew my mind. The Metobrook Heights HOA was in serious financial trouble. We're talking deep, deep trouble. There was a paper trail of fraud, misuse of funds, and even embezzlement. The HOA had been operating in the red for years, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. But the real shocker was the revelation about Victor Langston. He wasn't just a concerned neighbor. No, he had a plan, a big one. Victor owned a construction company, and he had been quietly buying up properties around Metobrook Heights for 2 years. Several homes, vacant lots, he was slowly acquiring land. And guess where my ranch sat? Right in the middle of his perfect development area. It was all starting to make sense. The water contamination, the constant harassment from the HOA, the legal threats, it was all part of a larger scheme to drive me off my land so Victor could swoop in and develop a luxury resort. I had been a pawn in their game, but not anymore. They had underestimated me. Now, I had the upper hand. And I was going to take them down. It was one of those rare moments when everything seemed to fall into place, when a plan, once murky and uncertain, suddenly became clear and sharp. The discovery of Victor's true intentions, the financial chaos within the HOA, and the corruption that had plagued Metobrook Heights for years gave me the focus I needed. I wasn't just fighting to save my ranch anymore, I was fighting for something bigger. For the integrity of the community. For people like Colleen, who had the courage to speak up, and for everyone who had been wronged by an HOA that had turned into a weapon for the rich and powerful. I knew that going public with this was the right move. But I also knew that I had to be careful. I needed to hit them where it would hurt the most, right in their pocketbooks. The HOA, despite its apparent power, was teetering on the brink of collapse, financially speaking. If I could expose their financial mismanagement and the illegal actions they had been hiding for so long, the legal pressure would start to mount. But I needed more than just that. I needed to make them realize they weren't untouchable. The first step was contacting the county tax office. I needed to know the exact details of the HOA's debt. What I discovered shocked me. Not only did the HOA owe back taxes for 5 years, but they had also accumulated nearly $200,000 in unpaid taxes, money that had been ignored for years by the HOA board. That was the key I needed. If the HOA couldn't pay, I had a legal right to step in and take over the property. The county was preparing for an auction, and once that auction took place, I would have the chance to seize control. I went straight to my lawyer, Graham Wexler, with the news. He was practically giddy when I laid it all out for him. "This is brilliant," he said. "If you can come up with the money to buy the debt, you can own their land, their community center, their entrance signs, everything. You can force a sale if they can't pay it back. And legally speaking, you'd have the right to make them pay you back or sell." It sounded too good to be true, but Graham was confident that it was all perfectly legal. So, I did what any rational man would do when faced with the opportunity to upend a corrupt system. I called my bank, scraped together most of my savings, and took out a loan against the ranch. It wasn't easy, but I knew that this was my one shot to turn the tables. With the money secured, I made the trip to the county office, cashier's check in hand, ready to make the purchase that would change everything. The look on the clerk's face when I explained what I wanted was priceless. She couldn't quite wrap her head around it. "You want to pay the HOA's back taxes?" she asked, bewildered, like I was some kind of madman. "Yes," I replied, steadying my nerves. "And once I pay, I become the creditor. I'll have the right to collect. And if they can't pay me back, I can petition for a public auction of their assets." The paperwork was simple enough, but the implications were enormous. Once I paid the debt, I had full legal rights to all the HOA's assets. I could force a sale of the common property and claim ownership of everything they controlled. That meant the community center, the playground, the entrance signs, everything that gave Lynette and her cronies any kind of power over the neighborhood. The best part was that I didn't even need them to repay me. All I had to do was prove they couldn't pay the debt, and then I could start the process to force the sale of their property. I wasn't just taking on the HOA, I was going to own them. A few days later, the county sent official notification to all the property owners in Metobrook Heights. The HOA's debt had been paid by a third party, me. Now, instead of owing the county, the HOA owed me. They had 60 days to pay it back, or I could petition for a public auction of their property. It didn't take long for the phone calls to start coming in. Most of them were from angry homeowners, demanding to know what was going on. "What do you mean we now owe you?" one caller shouted. "Why are you interfering with our HOA?" Some of the residents were confused, unsure what the next steps would be. But a few of them, seemed relieved. "Thank you," one woman said. "Maybe now we'll have a chance at fair leadership." But the call I had been waiting for came later that afternoon. It was Lynette. I could feel the panic in her voice as soon as I answered the phone. "What do you think you're doing?" she practically screamed. "You can't just buy our debt. That's not how this works. We were supposed to pay the county, not some random rancher." I let her rant, letting her frustration fill the silence on the other end of the line. I had no sympathy for her. "Actually, Lynette," I said, calm and deliberate, "that's exactly how debt works. The HOA owed money to the county, I paid it, and now you owe me. If you can't pay me back, I have the same rights the county had. I can petition for a public auction of your property." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the weight of what I had just said sinking in. Then, in a voice laced with desperation, Lynette responded, "This is not over. You have no idea what you've just started. We'll make sure you regret this." I knew she was bluffing. But the way she said it made me realize that this was no longer just about the HOA. This was about power, about control, and I was going to make sure she knew that I wasn't going to back down. By the time I hung up the phone, I had already made up my mind. This was no longer just a fight for my ranch. This was a battle to take back control from the people who had used their position to bully and manipulate everyone around them. I wasn't going to stop until I had exposed the full extent of their corruption. And I was going to make sure that Lynette, Victor, and everyone involved paid the price for their greed. Over the next 2 weeks, the tension in Metobrook Heights grew thicker. Word had spread about the impending auction, and more residents began to reach out to me. Some of them were angry, demanding answers. Others were starting to see what I had been trying to tell them all along, that the HOA was no longer serving them. It was serving its own interests, at the expense of everyone else. Colleen called me again, this time with news that made me smile. "We've got a coalition of residents who are ready to bid on the property at the auction. We want to take it back from the HOA, put it under community ownership, and start fresh." I was moved by the idea. The community could be something better, something that truly reflected the values it was built on: hard work, respect for the land, and fairness. It was an opportunity for them to take back control, to make sure their voices were heard. I agreed to work with them. After all, it was their community, and they had just as much at stake as I did. The auction was set for a few weeks later, and everything was coming together. But I also knew that Lynette and Victor weren't going to sit by and let it happen. The day of the auction, I arrived early, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I knew this was the final battle. This was the moment that would decide whether Metobrook Heights would remain in the hands of a corrupt HOA, or whether it would be returned to the people. The morning of the auction felt surreal, like the calm before a storm. The air was thick with anticipation as I parked my truck in the county courthouse parking lot. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over everything. But I could feel the tension rising, with each step I took toward the crowd of gathered residents, real estate investors, reporters, and curious onlookers, sending ripples through the air. It wasn't just an auction. It wasn't about buying and selling property in the usual way. This was a battle, the culmination of everything that had happened since Lynette Carrian first set foot on my ranch with her violation notices. This was my chance to take everything back, to expose the corruption that had festered under the guise of a community association, and to show the world that a few people could make a difference. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice for every person in Metobrook Heights who had been bullied, manipulated, and silenced. The courthouse parking lot was buzzing with activity. People were standing in small groups, talking, glancing nervously toward the front where the auctioneer's podium was set up. A small crowd of Metobrook Heights residents stood in front of me, and I recognized a few familiar faces, neighbors who had reached out after the meeting at the community center, people who had decided enough was enough. They stood behind me, eyes filled with determination. I had to admit, though, there was something unsettling about the whole thing. Even after everything I'd learned, after everything I'd fought for, I still wasn't sure how this was going to turn out. There were too many unknowns, too many moving parts. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let Lynette and Victor win. Not without a fight. As I took my place near the podium, I saw Lynette standing by her attorney at the other side of the lot, looking exhausted and pale. She was wearing a different outfit today, one that seemed less regal and more frantic, as though she was trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. Her makeup was smudged, the foundation uneven, and her posture was stiff, defensive. She wasn't the confident chairwoman of the HOA anymore. She was just a woman caught in the web of her own lies and greed. Victor Langston, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. His absence was both suspicious and relieving. I couldn't help but wonder if he was sitting back, letting Lynette take the fall for everything, as he continued with his plans to turn Metobrook Heights into his next luxury resort development. The auctioneer finally stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat. The noise from the crowd quieted down as he began the formalities, listing the properties that would be up for bid, the community center, the playground, the entrance signs, all the common areas that had once been the HOA's domain. These were the assets that Lynette and her cronies had relied on to control the neighborhood, the very things that gave them their power. And now, those assets were mine for the taking. "Let's get started, folks," the auctioneer announced, his voice booming across the lot. "We're starting with the common property of Metobrook Heights, including all community assets. The opening bid is set at $230,000, the amount paid to settle the back taxes." I could feel the eyes on me, the weight of the moment settling heavily in my chest. I glanced at the crowd, and I saw Colleen standing near the back with a small group of residents. They were ready. They had come together, pooled their resources, and they were determined to reclaim the community that had been taken from them. This wasn't just my battle anymore, it was theirs too. The residents were ready for change. And that made all the difference. The auctioneer began the bidding, and the number slowly started to climb. There were a few hesitant bids at first, but then the investors, those who had been eyeing the property for its potential, started to get serious. The bids came faster now, and I could see Lynette's face tightening with every passing moment, as if each new offer was chipping away at her last shred of hope. She looked over at me, her eyes narrowed in anger and disbelief. But I wasn't backing down. I wasn't going to let them take what was rightfully mine. When the bidding hit $350,000, I raised my hand. $350,000, I called out, my voice firm and clear. The auctioneer paused, looking from me to the investors, then back to me again. Going once, going twice. The investors hesitated. I could see the doubt in their eyes. They had expected to buy the property at a fraction of its worth, but they hadn't anticipated the determination of the people behind me. The residents of Metobrook Heights weren't just bidding on a plot of land. They were bidding on the chance to take control of their community and to make sure that it stayed true to its roots. Sold. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down, and the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers, boos, and whispers. But I didn't care about the noise. I was focused on the result. The HOA's property was mine. I could see Lynette's face fall, her shoulders slumping as she realized what had just happened. She had lost. Her reign was over. And for the first time since she had marched onto my ranch with that violation notice, I felt a rush of relief wash over me. This wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for the entire community. The people of Metobrook Heights had stood up, they had fought back, and now they had won. As I walked away from the podium, my heart still racing with adrenaline, Colleen approached me, a wide grin spreading across her face. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with awe and gratitude. "We did it." I smiled back, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It had been a long, hard battle, but it had been worth every second of it. "We did it," I agreed, my voice thick with emotion. But as the crowd started to disperse, I couldn't help but think of Lynette. She was standing by the podium, talking with her attorney in hushed tones, clearly trying to figure out her next move. There was no doubt in my mind that she wouldn't give up that easily. She would fight tooth and nail to keep her control, to claw her way back into power. But I knew that the game had changed. The people had spoken. And Lynette had lost. As I made my way to my truck, I felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of unease. I knew that this was just the beginning. The HOA might have been defeated, but there were still other battles to fight. Victor Langston's development plans weren't going to disappear, and Edith Morse, the corrupt HOA secretary, was still out there, facing criminal charges for her role in the embezzlement. But for now, I had won the most important battle. I had protected my land. And more importantly, I had shown the community that they didn't have to accept being bullied. The rest of the day passed in a blur of congratulations and handshakes, but my mind kept drifting back to the auction. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only one small part of a much larger story. The power that people like Lynette and Victor had wielded wasn't just about property. It was about control. And as long as there were people who were willing to stand up, to fight for what was right, that control could be taken back. I climbed into my truck, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline, and I drove back to the ranch. The sun was setting as I passed through the familiar gates, and the ranch looked the same as it always had, quiet, peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the last few weeks. My cattle were grazing in the fields, the sound of their low calls mingling with the breeze. This land was mine. It always had been. And now, it always would be. I smiled to myself as I parked in front of the house and got out. There was still work to be done, of course. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But for tonight, for the first time in a long time, I could rest easy knowing that the ranch, my grandfather's land, was safe. And as I watched the sunset from the porch, I knew one thing for certain: sometimes the best way to protect what you love is to stand your ground and fight for it, no matter how hard it gets. Because in the end, it's worth it. The weeks following the auction were a whirlwind of changes. The new ownership of Metobrook Heights common property didn't just give me control, it gave the entire community a chance to start fresh. I worked alongside Colleen and the others who had come together to make a real difference. We went through every inch of the community, assessing what needed to be done, what could be improved, and most importantly, what could be preserved. There was no more talk of petty violations. No more threats of fines for things as trivial as a child's bicycle left in a driveway or a rosebush growing just a few inches past the approved setback line. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear and conformity, began to breathe again. People started to take pride in their homes, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. There was a sense of unity that had been missing for years, a sense of ownership, not just of property, but of the community itself. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the work I'd put in, the risks I'd taken, had truly paid off. The community was healing, and the ranch, my grandfather's land, was no longer just a place to survive, it was a place to thrive. Lynette's downfall didn't happen overnight, but it was swift and inevitable. Once the auction results became public, her position became untenable. She was forced to resign as chairwoman of the HOA, and the whispers began, about her mismanagement, her personal vendettas, and the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. By the time her house went up for sale, I heard through the grapevine that she had taken a job in another state, far away from any HOA authority. The stress of the legal battle, combined with the public exposure of her actions, had clearly taken its toll. Victor Langston's development dreams were dashed as well. The exposure of his involvement in the HOA's financial collapse and his attempts to manipulate the system for his own gain had earned him the scrutiny of local authorities. He may have thought he could pull the strings from the shadows, but when the light was shone on him, his empire of lies crumbled. I didn't have to lift a finger to stop him. His own greed and carelessness did the job for me. As for Edith Morse, the former HOA secretary, she had fled the state before the full extent of her embezzlement was revealed. But justice was patient, and the law was coming for her. She couldn't hide forever. The evidence against her was too strong, and the residents of Metobrook Heights had been more than willing to press charges. I often found myself thinking about how her greed and deceit had poisoned everything they touched, but in the end, it had all come undone. The most satisfying part of this entire ordeal, though, was watching the community transform. Colleen Rodas, now the new chairwoman, was determined to lead with a steady hand. Her first act was to dismantle the petty regulations that had made life unbearable for so many residents. She worked to ensure that the HOA would truly serve the people, not the other way around. The roses were allowed to bloom without the threat of fines, the children played freely, and the lawns, while neat, were allowed to have a little character. It was a far cry from the sterile, cookie-cutter vision that Lynette had tried to impose. As for me, I didn't change much. I was still the same rancher I had always been, getting up at dawn to feed the cattle, mending fences, and maintaining the equipment. But now, instead of being seen as an eyesore, my ranch was embraced as part of the community's identity. My cattle, once considered a nuisance, became a symbol of the community's rural heritage. I even started giving educational tours for local kids, showing them the ropes of ranch life, teaching them about agriculture, and introducing them to the animals they had once only seen from behind a fence. The quiet, peaceful rhythm of the ranch was restored, but there was something new in the air. It wasn't just the wind rustling through the trees or the sound of hooves in the fields. It was the feeling of victory, of knowing that, against all odds, I had stood my ground, and that my actions had led to something better for everyone involved. I often think back to those days of tension and uncertainty, to the moments when I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing or if I was just making things worse. But what I've learned through it all is this: sometimes the best way to preserve what you love is to fight for it. It's not about being the loudest voice or the strongest force, it's about standing up when others won't, speaking the truth when it's hard, and holding on to what matters when the world is telling you to let go. Metobrook Heights is better now. Not perfect, but better. The residents are more connected, more involved, and more proud of their homes than ever before. The community that once felt cold and controlled now feels warm and inviting. And as for me, my family's land is safe. It always was, but now it feels even more like home. So, with that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.